A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
What parts of the Kedushah should be said by the Tzibur, and what parts should be said by the Shaliach Tzibur?
The Kedushah, it must be understood first and foremost, is part of the tefillah of the Shliach Tzibur. That is to say, it is part of the Shmoneh Esrei, the 18 brachot of the Shmoneh Esrei that the Shliach Tzibur recites before the Tzibur. And the Tzibur is to answer all of the brachot, including the third bracha in which we find the Kedushah during the repetition of the Shliach Tzibur. In other words, first we must understand that Kedushah is not something that stands alone. It is not a separate unit or concept or procedure unto itself. It is part and parcel of the tefillah. Having understood this, it will become clear that just as we do not say the other parts of the tefillah, of the Shliach Tzibur, when the repetition of the Shliach Tzibur is in progress, we do not help him along, we do not say certain parts of the tefillah. It is his job, the part of the Shliach Tzibur, to recite all of the tefillah aloud and for us just to hear and answer Amen. The same applies to the third bracha of the tefillah, just as it applies to the first or the 18th bracha. And therefore, we find in all the sources that it is absolutely clear that, except for 2 or 3 specific responses of the Tzibur, which are in and of themselves something of a chidush, something a little bit unusual, that we would say anything at all during the repetition of the Shliach Tzibur, apart from those very limited responses, everything else is to be said only by the Shliach Tzibur. That is the matter in brief, and now we will go into some of the details. We find in the Tosefta, in Masechet Barachot, in the first perek, it speaks about the different barachot that we say, those that begin with the words Baruch Atah Hashem and those that begin without those words. And then it goes on to say, with regards to the repetition of the Amidah by the Shliach Tzibur, Rabbi Yehuda haya oneh im hamevarech, that is to say, he would answer and say together with the mevarech, that is to say, the person who is saying the brachot of the tefillah, that is to say, the Shliach Tzibur, Rabbi Yehuda haya oneh im hamevarech kadosh kadosh kadosh, he would answer that line of kadosh kadosh kadosh, etc. He would, and just that one line, that pasuk, he would respond together with the mevarech, together with the Shliach Tzibur. And the other one that mentions here is Baruch Kavod Adonai Mimekomo. That too he would answer together, he would recite together with the Shliach Tzibur. In other words, it is not to be said first by the Tzibur and then by the Shliach Tzibur, or in the opposite order. It is to be said together by the Shliach Tzibur and the Tzibur together at the same time. Kol elu haya koreh Rabbi Yehuda im hamevarech. In other words, the Tosefta here comes to explain that this, and only in this case, these responses of the Kedushah are to be said by the Tzibur together with the person saying the bracha, as opposed to what? As opposed to most brachot, where we hear a bracha, we do not participate in the recitation of that bracha. At the end of that bracha, we say Amen. These particular responses, which are not really brachot, and that's why they're different, they are rather designed. The Kedushah is written, is worded in such a way that the Shliach Tzibur invites the public, the Tzibur, to respond to what he's about to say, and then we respond together with him. He and we together, all of us together, respond and say these words of Kadosh, 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 and Baruch Kavod Adonai Mimekomo. Only those responses are mentioned here in the Tosefta as being the practice of Rabbi Yehuda to respond to the Shliach Tzibur. It seems that many other Chachamim, maybe most of the Jews at that time, did not respond at all to the Kedushah of the Shliach Tzibur. Perhaps it was said only by the Shliach Tzibur. And Rabbi Yehuda's practice was to recite it together with the Shliach Tzibur, but only those specific lines. And this practice over time became the standard normative practice. And what we find in later generations, that a third line was added to this list of responses, and that is Yimloch Adonai Le'olam. That third verse was also added, as we will now see when we read some of the Rishonim, the Gaonim and the Rishonim. With regards to the way in which Kedushah is to be recited, Rav Saadia Gaon in his Sidur on page Lamed Het 38 writes as follows, that when the Shliach Tzibur gets to the third Baracha, he says, Wa Omer, in the singular, he, the Shliach Tzibur, says, Nakdishacha, or Nakdishach, or Na'risach, etc., that introduction. And then he says, Wa'onim, that is to say in the plural, the Tzibur answers Kadosh, 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 till the end of that pasuk, Malochol Ha'aretz Kavodo. And then he says again in the singular, Wa'omer, that is to say the Shliach Tzibur says, Az Bara'ash Gadol Adir Wa Hazak, etc., until he gets to the words Meshabahim Wa'omerim. And then again in the plural, he writes, Wa'onim, and they respond, Baruch Kavod Adonai Mimakomo. And then he again, it says, Wa'omer, in the singular, Mimakomcha Makenu Thufia. This is the Nusach of Rav Saadia Gaon, and this is apparently the original Nusach, the more authentic Nusach that was recited every day at all, during every Chazat Hashatz. He, the Shliach Tzibur, recites Mimakomcha Makenu Thufia, and then the Tzibur answers, according to this Nusach, Machal Timloch B'Tzion, there everyone answers Amen. He says in the plural, Wa'onim Amen. This is also the Nusach of the Rambam, as we will see. And then he continues, and when he gets to Yimloch, again he says in the plural, Wa'onim Yimloch, and everyone answers Yimloch. And then he continues, Lador Wador Nagid Godlecha, in the singular, Wa'omer, Lador Wador Nagid Godlecha. In other words, from Rav Saadia Gaon, we see very clearly and explicitly, very precisely, he says, he says, they say. He says this, they say that. The only three things that the Tzibur is to say, according to Rav Saadia Gaon, is Kadosh, 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 Baruch Kavod Adonai Mimakomo, and Yimloch Adonai Le'olam, and nothing further. Similarly, in the Rambam, in Hilchot Tefillah, Perek Tef, Rambam writes, Wa'omer Kedushah Bivracha Shalishit. He, in the singular, Wa'omer, recites the Kedushah in the third Baracha of the Chazrat Hashatz. And that's all the Rambam has to say here in the body of the text of Hilchot Tefillah. However, later, at the end of Sefer Ahava, where he has the order of the Tefillah, the Nusach of the Tefillah, there Rambam writes as follows. He says, he brings the Nusach of the Kedushah, which is very similar to Rav Saadia Gaon's Nusach, and then he goes on to say as follows: Ba'eth sheshaliach Tzibur omer bivracha zo v'kara za al za v'amar. When the Shliach Tzibur gets to the words, when he recites this bracha, then Kol Ha'am Onim, then everyone answers and says, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzavaoth, Malochol Ha'aretz Kavodo. Ucheshehu Omer, and when he gets to the point where he says, Ayem Enkom Kavodo, Kol Ha'am Onim, Meshabahim Omerim, Baruch Kavod Adonai Mimakomo. Ucheshehu Omer, B'Hayenu V'Yomenu, Kol Ha'am Onim, Amen. This is again similar to Rav Saadia Gaon's Nusach. Ucheshehu Omer, Alidei David Mashiach Sidkecha, Kol Ha'am Onim, Yimloch Adonai Le'olam, Elohai Tzion, Ador V'Ador, Hallelujah. This, by the way, the Rambam introduced this entire section in his Nusach of the Tefillah at the end of Sefer Ahava by saying as follows: Shaliach Tzibur mevarech, in the singular, mevarech le'olam beracha shlishit b'nosach zeh. In other words, Rambam is saying and telling us, as we explained at the beginning, that this beracha, this third beracha of the Tefillah, is exactly that. It is the third bracha of the Tefillah. It is like the fourth bracha, and like the first, and like the 17th bracha. It is something which the Shliach Tzibur is to say, except that in this particular case, this is an unusual case, and this is the only exception. These are the only exceptions to the rule. Here there are particular points and statements, brief phrases, which the Tzibur is to answer. But the concept that the entire Nusach of the Kedushah should be recited by all of the Tzibur, by each individual, this we do not find in any of the ancient sources. And again we find the very same thing in the Tur. Rabbeinu Yaakov Bar Turim, the son of the Rosh, he writes in Siman Kof Kaf He, Ulahar she'yisayem beracha sheniya, when the Shliach Tzibur gets to the end of the second beracha, Yomar in the singular, Nakdishach u'na'risach, he says the introduction to the third beracha, to the Kedushah in the singular, he only recites it. And then وَيَعَنُوا in the plural, وَيَعَنُوا أَحْرَاءُ كِدُوشَا. And then the Tzibur answers, وَأُمَرِيم. What do they say? We'll see in a moment. Because he mentions here parenthetically the Ashkenazim have a slightly different nusach. Instead of Nakdishach v'Na'risach, they have the nusach Nekadesh Shimcha Ba'olam. And then, having heard the introduction from the Shliach Tzibur, then everyone answers, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. And this is, therefore, it's quite plain, therefore, that according to the Torah, just as we saw in the Rambam, just as we saw in the Sa'adiyah Gaon, just as we see in the Tosefta, only these very specific parts of the Kedushah are to be said by the Tzibur and nothing else. And the Beit Yosef discusses this point and writes as follows. He says, Nir'eh midivrei Rabbeinu, it seems from what we see here in the Torah, she'en ha-tzibur omerim ima hazan nakdishach. It is not for the tzibur to say the beginning of the Kedushah, nakdishach u'na'risach, ela shothekim u'mechavanim lema sheshleach tzibur omer. They are to hear, to listen, to be silent and to hear what the Shliach Tzibur says. Ucheshem magia l'kadosh, when he gets to the point where he says zeh zeh amar, then they are to answer az yanu yamru kadosh kadosh kadosh. V'chen katav harosh, and this is also the view of the Rosh, says the Beit Yosef in a Teshuvah klal daled siman yotet, and he writes as follows. He quotes the Rosh. Davar pashut, what is obvious. She'en lomar kaddish im hazan. One is not to say kaddish. We're not talking about Kedushah. For one moment, the Rosh is addressing both the issues together. He says we are not to respond, rather to say kaddish together with the Hazan. When the Hazan says kaddish, we do not say kaddish with him, we listen. And it's clear that it is not allowed to say kaddish. Ki en omrim kaddish ela b'asara. It is only possible to say kaddish when you have a tzibur, and what that means is that one person says and the others hear and listen. We have to listen to what he says and answer at the appropriate time. And the same is true, the same holds true, says the Rosh B'Kedushah, for the Kedushah in the Shmon Esrei. Omer Hazan Nakdishach u'Na'risach, he says the beginning. Ad shemagia lakadosh, v'az onim ha-tzibur kadosh. And then the tzibur answers kadosh. So we see that there is universal agreement amongst all the Geonim and Rishonim that this is the proper way in which we are to say the Kedushah, and this is also the view of the Gra, who, as usual, follows in the footsteps of the Rishonim and does not consider it to be correct to change anything in such matters. He writes is brought in his name in the Ma'aseh Rav, Oth Mem Daled, Siman Mem Daled 44, Nekadesh or Na'risach, depending on the Nusach, Ashkenaz or another Nusach. The beginning of the Kedushah, he says, Nekadesh or Na'risach, is to be said ad wa amar until you get to the point where he says v'kara zeh zeh wa amar. Eino omer rak hashatz. Only the Shliach Tzibur is to say levad, only he. V'hasibur shotekim v'shomeim mishliach tzibur. So we see this is the view, the universal view of the Rishonim and those Achronim as well, whose intention it always was, whose practice it was, to maintain the original practices and customs and halachot of Hazal and the Rishonim.
Then why is it that the common practice diverges from that which the rabbi has conveyed?
In this case, as in many other cases, that which is much more common today, which is the practice where the entire tzibur recites the beginning and all of the Kedushah, in fact, is a custom which sprung up only a few centuries ago in the wake of certain Kabbalistic influences, which are clearly at odds with all the original sources that we quoted, at odds with the Tosefta from Chazal, and at odds with the Geonim, as we quoted from Al-Sa'adiyah Gaon and the Rishonim and the Gra, and this is something that is difficult to explain and is not a practice that should be countenanced. The correct practice, as the Gra points out also, is that we maintain the original format and configuration of the tefillah as intended all along by Chazal, and this is there's no reason whatever to deviate from the original form and practice of the tefillah.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message, and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.